No one ever wants to believe that the friendly neighbor, the one who smiles and waves at you, is a monster in disguise, or even worse, hiding a couple bodies in his garage just a couple feet away from you. We tell ourselves evil has a face we would recognize, a warning we could see maybe. But the truth is far more terrifying than we think. These predators walk among us every day. Like the Hollywood filmmaker who turned his twisted fiction into a bloodbath in his garage, or the Ivy League genius whose brilliance masked a brutal predatory rage. Even worse, the friendly stranger who offers you a ride back home. They hide in plain sight, their true nature only revealed when it's far too late. In this series, we unmask some of the most brutal serial killers we have ever seen. It's 1:30 in the morning at a Denny's restaurant in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. A man walks in with a little girl. She looks terrified. They slide into a booth, but something is terribly wrong. A waitress, refilling coffee at a nearby table, freezes. She recognizes the little girl's face from the billboards from the nightly news. It's 8-year-old Shasta Groen, the child who vanished from a bloody crime scene 48 days ago. The waitress alerts her manager, who quietly dials 911. Minutes later, police cruisers slide into the parking lot, their lights off. The man at the table with Shasta sees them. He abruptly stands, tells the waitress he needs his check, and pulls the little girl towards the restroom, but it's too late. When he returns, officers are waiting. They surround him, leading him outside into the cool night air. An officer kneels down to the little girl. She tells him her name is Shasta. She wants to go home. The man who brought her here, the monster the entire nation had been searching for, was a 42-year-old sex offender named Joseph Edward Duncan III. The story of how it began would reveal a depth of evil that would scar the state of Idaho forever. In the Wolf Lodge area, about 8 miles east of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, sat a small white cinder block house with green trim. It was the home of the Groen and Mackenzie family. The house was somewhat secluded, surrounded by trees and low-lying hills. The first home you'd see after getting off the interstate. 40-year-old Brenda Groen, her 37-year-old boyfriend Mark Mackenzie, her 13-year-old son Slade, and her 2 youngest, 9-year-old Dylan and 8-year-old Shasta, lived a quiet life there. In mid-May of 2005, Joseph Duncan, a fugitive sex offender fleeing from Minnesota, drove past that house. He was in a stolen Jeep with stolen plates, armed with a shotgun, a claw hammer, and night vision goggles. He saw Shasta and Dylan playing outside, and in that moment, he chose his victims. For at least 2 days, he watched them from a hidden vantage point, studying their routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came on Sunday, May 15th. The family had spent the day in town, returning home for a barbecue that lasted into the early evening. It was the last time anyone would see Brenda, Mark, and Slade alive. Joseph Duncan's evil wasn't born overnight. It was a cancer that grew for decades, nurtured in the shadows. His childhood, spent in Tacoma, Washington, wasn't marked by a single explosive trauma, but by a steady, chilling descent into violence. In 1978, by 15, he wasn't just a troubled kid, he was a full-blown predator. He forced a 9-year-old boy at gunpoint. A year later, he was arrested in a stolen car. He was later sent to a juvenile detention center. There, he made a haunting confession to a therapist. He claimed he had bound and assaulted 6 different boys. He estimated he'd victimized 13 younger boys by the time he was 16. This wasn't a cry for help. It was a boast. In 1980, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for assaulting a 14-year-old boy. He was paroled 14 years later, but freedom didn't reform him. It just unleashed him. That's when the nightmare really began. Around him, a string of unsolved cases involving children began to pile up. In 1996, two half-sisters, 11-year-old Sammy Jo White and 9-year-old Carmen Cubeya, vanished from Seattle. Their bodies were found 2 years later. A year after they disappeared, 7-year-old Deborah Palmer was found washed up on a beach in Oak Harbor, Washington. Duncan was in the area for all of these crimes, a ghost moving through the periphery of tragedies he likely caused. Then, in 1997, he fled to California. There, 10-year-old Anthony Martinez was lured from his home by a man offering money to help find a lost cat. Anthony's body was found 15 days later, bound and beaten to death in the desert. Duncan was visiting his father just 22 miles away at the time. He was a predator hiding in plain sight, and he was heading for Idaho. The day after that Sunday barbecue, a neighbor stopped by the grown Mackenzie home to pay Slade $10 for mowing his lawn. The house was eerily quiet. The family's cars were in the driveway, their doors left wide open. The neighbor knocked, but no one answered. Only a dog barked from inside. Feeling a knot of dread in his stomach, he immediately called the cops. When deputies from the Kootenai County Sheriff's Department arrived, they entered through an unlocked rear door and walked into a slaughterhouse. Blood was everywhere. In the kitchen, they found two bodies, bound with duct tape and zip ties, their heads horrifically crushed. In the living room, a third victim was found in the same state. The victims were soon identified as Brenda Groen, her son Slade, and her boyfriend Mark Mackenzie. They had all been bludgeoned to death. Investigators believe the weapon was a claw hammer. But that's not even the worst part. 8-year-old Shasta and 9-year-old Dylan were gone. An Amber Alert was issued, and the largest criminal investigation in the county's history began. While the nation searched, Shasta and Dylan were living through hell. Duncan had driven them from their home to a remote campsite deep in the Lolo National Forest of Montana. There, in a dilapidated wooden cabin, he became the director of his own twisted horror film. He forced the children to call him Jed. He documented everything with a video camera, the torture, the fear, the repeated assaults. In her later testimony, Shasta would recall the smallest, most chilling details. She remembered Duncan wearing dark gloves inside their house and carrying a shotgun. She remembered the brand name of the hammer he used to kill her family of Fat Max. He bragged to the children about it, telling them exactly how he'd used it on their mother, brother, and Mark. He showed them the night vision goggles he'd used to stalk them for days, for weeks. He subjected them to unspeakable acts. Shasta recounted how he repeatedly tortured her brother, Dylan, even burning him with cigarettes. The videos he recorded captured it all, monstrous evidence of his crimes. At one point, he took Dylan, shot him in the head as Shasta watched, and then burned his body. He had become judge, jury, and executioner in his own private world of terror. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse, after weeks of this torment, Duncan made a critical mistake. He got comfortable. He got arrogant. On the night of July 2nd, he drove back to Coeur d'Alene, took Shasta to a Denny's, and stepped out of the shadows and into the light. Inside, a quick-thinking waitress recognized Shasta from the news and alerted her manager, who called the cops. As police cruisers quietly converged on the restaurant, Duncan saw them and tried to retreat with Shasta. He was surrounded and arrested without a fight, bringing the 48-day nationwide search to a dramatic close right there in the Denny's parking lot. With Duncan in custody and Shasta safe, the full scope of his depravity came into focus. The stolen Jeep he was driving was a treasure trove of evidence: the dark gloves, the 12-gauge shotgun, the night vision goggles, and the video camcorder. On that camera was a record of every monstrous act he committed in the woods. The footage was so horrific that prosecutors fought to keep it from being copied, fearing it would leak to the public. Based on Shasta's brave testimony, investigators located the remote Montana campsite and found Dylan's remains. The evidence was overwhelming. In court, Joseph Duncan showed no emotion. When the judge asked if he had anything to say about slaughtering a family and torturing 2 children, his response was flat and devoid of humanity. "I have nothing to say." He pleaded guilty to the Idaho murders and kidnappings to avoid having Shasta testify at a state trial. He received 3 consecutive life sentences, but that wasn't the end. The federal government then took over. At his federal trial, jurors were forced to watch his homemade videos of torture. The jury didn't just call him a murderer, they sentenced him to death 3 times over. But what came next shocked everyone. His confession to the FBI about the Idaho crimes led them to re-examine the cold case of 10-year-old Anthony Martinez in California. A partial thumbprint found on the duct tape used to bind Anthony nearly a decade earlier was finally matched to Duncan. In 2011, he was extradited to California, where he pleaded guilty to that murder as well, adding another 2 life sentences to his tally. He was a serial killer who had slipped through the cracks of the justice system for decades, leaving a trail of broken families in his wake. The grown house on Frontage Road is long gone, but the scars on the community remain. The case served as a brutal reminder that evil can find its way into even the most peaceful corners of the world. He forced the first girl into the trunk of his car. In the suffocating darkness, she could only listen. She could hear her friend's voice in the car, then his. She heard the struggle, the muffled sounds of a desperate fight on a deserted road in Preston, Connecticut. She shouted words of comfort, anything to let her friend know she wasn't alone. And then, she heard the final, sickening silence, followed by footsteps as the man walked away. A couple minutes later, he returned to the car, opened the trunk, and choked the living daylight out of her. A clean kill to prevent her from ever identifying him. Her friend, April Brune, already lay dead nearby, brutally assaulted and strangled. It was 1984, and for Michael Ross, the nightmare was just another day's work. The seeds of this horror were sown years earlier on a family egg farm in rural Connecticut. Michael Ross grew up under the iron fist of a mother prone to erratic, frenzied punishments. She was a woman who would later be admitted to a psychiatric hospital, a woman whose relationship with his father was always on the verge of collapse. And for 10-year-old Michael, one of his many chores became a chilling prophecy. He was regularly tasked with strangling the weak and deformed chickens. He'd wrap his small hands around their necks and squeeze until they went limp. It wasn't about cruelty, not at first. It was about pleasing his parents, about doing the job he was told to do. His childhood was a cracked mirror of neglect and abuse. He was the eldest of 4, beaten relentlessly by his mother. He was also raped by an uncle. By the time he left home, he was an extremely angry young man, a boy who didn't like the world at all. He had learned a terrible lesson on that farm, that life was cheap, and that power came from the pressure of your own hands. Despite the chaos at home, Michael Ross developed a strong work ethic. He was intelligent, shockingly so, with a tested IQ of 155. His impressive high school grades earned him a place at the prestigious Cornell University, where he studied economics. To his peers, he was approachable, if a little awkward. He tried to form relationships with girls, but he lacked the empathy, the basic human skills to make them work. This mask of normalcy, this veneer of the smart, quiet college student, was paper thin. Underneath, a sexually charged rage was simmering whenever a girl dumped him. Whenever he felt that sting of rejection, the pressure would build until it had to be released. That's when the roadside strangler was born. The descent into murder doesn't happen overnight. It's a long, dark incubation. It starts with fantasies, with stalking, with small offenses that build and build. For Michael Ross, the final threshold was crossed in May of 1981. She was a fellow Cornell student, 25-year-old Zung Nok Tu. They had been in the same evening class on campus. Soon after, her body was found in a creek at the bottom of a gorge near the fraternity house where Ross lived. Police initially suspected suicide, but her family and friends were furious. They refused to believe it. A later examination revealed injuries that didn't match a leap to her death, but with no evidence, the case went cold. It would be years before anyone knew the truth, that the quiet economics student from their class had become a killer. After that first kill, something inside him broke for good. He got away with it, and with that, the addiction took hold. It was always after something happened in his personal life that he'd take his anger out on a victim. It didn't matter who she was. It just had to be another girl. He called them subjects. He claimed he saw them as impersonal objects, so detached that if you asked him to pick one out of a lineup immediately after a murder, he wouldn't even recognize her face. By April 1984, Michael Ross was deep into his horrific killing spree, his attacks becoming more frequent and ruthless. He preyed on young women, often after personal setbacks, and had established a chilling pattern of offering rides to his unsuspecting victims. It was under these terrifying circumstances that he encountered 14-year-old April Brune and her best friend, Leslie Shelley. The two girls, inseparable and just leaving the movies, were hitchhiking home when Ross, ever on the hunt, offered them a ride. They accepted, unknowingly stepping into his car and into the last moments of their lives as he drove them away from their anticipated destination to a deserted road in Preston, where his assault began. His first move was to isolate one of the girls to ensure his dominance and prevent escape. He brutally forced Leslie Shelley into the trunk of his car, effectively removing her from the scene and securing her where she couldn't intervene or flee. With Leslie trapped and out of sight, Ross then turned his full attention to April Brune. In a desperate act of self-preservation, April attempted to defend herself with a small knife, while Leslie, from the confines of the trunk, shouted words of comfort and encouragement to her friend. Ross then proceeded to brutally rape and strangle April Brune to death. After her murder, he returned to the car, pulling Leslie Shelley from the trunk. Claiming he considered her brave for her actions, he chose not to rape Leslie, but instead, he choked her to death as well, to prevent any possibility of her identifying him later. His final victim was Wendy Barabal. In June of 1984, the 17-year-old left a note for her parents, saying she was walking to a local shop. She never returned. Michael, whose pattern of targeting young women was well established by this point, abducted her as she was on her way. Her body was later found under a pile of rocks on the side of a road in Griswold, Connecticut. But this time, there was a small mistake. A single loose thread that would unravel everything. During the investigation, police received a tip. A man had been seen sitting in a blue Toyota car right near where Wendy's body was found. Michael Ross owned a car matching that description, and his house was in the vicinity of several of the murders. He immediately became a suspect. When police knocked on his door, the game was finally up. Michael Bruce Ross was finally arrested. Some killers deny everything. Others, driven by ego, can't wait to tell you what they did. Michael Ross confessed immediately. But the true horror wasn't found in his house. It was revealed in an interrogation room under the probing of criminologist Christopher Barry D., who was trying to clear 2 unsolved homicides. Barry D. knew he was dealing with a psychopath. To get the truth, he had to play a game. He had to manipulate the manipulator. He made Ross comfortable, took off his handcuffs, and let him talk. Ross started boasting, talking about how long it took to strangle a girl, about the multiple bruises around their necks because they would wriggle on the floor. He spoke with no emotion, a cold recitation of facts. That's when Barry D. looked him in the eye and said, "Michael, you're not a big hitter. 6, 7 victims? That's nothing. You're not a Ted Bundy. You're small fry." Ross was stunned. His ego, the engine of his entire murderous career, was wounded. "No," he snapped back. "I've done 7. The criminologist pushed back, feigning disbelief. And that's when the truth started bleeding through. Ross confessed to everything. He described killing Zung Tu at Cornell, throwing her over a dam. He described killing Paula Pereira, dumping her body by a willow tree. He recalled what she was wearing, her school uniform, and when asked what he did with her body, he said, "I treated it like so much trash, like garbage. I'd used her, abused her, and walked away." With those confessions, armed with details only the killer could know, police were able to charge him with 2 more murders, finally bringing his official count to 8. The parents of his victims finally had answers, but they were answers born from a place of unimaginable darkness. In July of 1987, Michael Ross received 6 separate death sentences, but the legal battles were far from over. Years of appeals followed, and in 1994, the sentences were overturned on a technicality. But then, something strange happened. 4 years later, Ross gave up. He stopped fighting his death sentence. He claimed he had found God in prison. He felt guilt. He spent his time working as a Braille translator, hoping for some kind of redemption. He even got engaged to a woman named Susan Powers while on death row. To some, he was a reformed character. To the families of his victims, he was a monster playing his final game. On May 13th, 2005, Michael Ross was administered a lethal injection at a correctional institution in Connecticut. In the viewing room, the families of some of the women he had murdered watched as the roadside strangler took his last breath. Evil is a simple word for a complex thing. Some people are good, some are evil. Most of us live in the gray area in between, but Michael Ross lived at the extreme. He was the devil hiding behind the face of the boy next door. A 75-year-old woman stood frozen in her son's doorway. The house was strangely quiet. She stepped inside to find a strange sight. Her son's cows had wandered loose near the entrance. He never let his cows roam free. As she walked deeper into the house, she called out to her son and grandchildren, but no one answered. Her feet dragged with each step, growing heavier as she moved through the silent rooms, and then she saw it. A dark, sticky pool of blood was seeping from beneath the bedroom door. Her son lay motionless on his bed. A gaping hole ran straight through his forehead. Beside him was her grandson, bearing the same terrible wound and the same deadly stillness. Her eyes then found the smaller bed where her 9-year-old granddaughter, laying still in the same horrific state, staring blankly at the ceiling. Her scream tore through the quiet village morning, the first sound anyone had heard from that house in days. This is the story about how a serial killer called Hammerman terrorized China for 4 years. Lee Shinda was a 34-year-old widower just trying to raise 2 children alone. His wife had died just months before, leaving him with 13-year-old young Lee and 9-year-old Yang Yang. Lee made it a daily habit to visit his mother, Han Fongying, over the years. But for 2 days now, Han hadn't seen her son. Initially, she attributed his absence to grief. However, Lee Shinda wasn't one to simply vanish, not without informing her, and certainly not without arranging care for his children. That morning, she walked the familiar path to his house. And when she arrived, Lee Shinda's house was silent. She knocked, but there was no answer. She called his name. Nothing. But then, she hears his cows mooing from inside the house. There's something wrong. Lee always let his cows out at first light. Beneath a loose stone by the door, the spare key lay in its usual spot. Her hands trembled as she inserted it into the lock. And what happened next would shatter everything she thought she knew about the world. Han Fangying's heart stopped as she opened the door. In the main room, cows stood restless and confused, but it was the sight beyond them that truly froze her. Through the open bedroom door, she could see still shapes beneath the covers of the beds. It looked like her son and grandchildren. She called their names, but there was no movement. As she moved closer, her son lay beside her grandson on the larger bed. Both of them had been beaten beyond recognition. There were holes in their foreheads. Perfect, round holes that could only have been made by something hard and heavy, driven with tremendous force. But it was the mud on little young Lee's hands that broke her, mud under his fingernails. Her grandson had tried to run, but someone had dragged him back. Someone had finished what they started. On the smaller bed lay Yang Yang. 9 years old, her school uniform was gone. Her body was positioned in a way that no child ever should be, and in the center of her forehead, that same terrible hole. Han Fangying fell to her knees and screamed until the neighbors came running. Within hours, the small house was swarming with police officers. Nothing like this had ever happened in their quiet community. The police had no leads, no witnesses, no obvious motive. Days bled into weeks, and the trail grew cold. The killer had vanished without a trace, like smoke carried away by the wind. What the police didn't know at the time was that the holes in those foreheads weren't random violence, they were a signature. And somewhere out there, the monster who left this signature was already choosing his next victims. Yang Xinhai was born into poverty in 1968 in Hunan province. He was the middle child in a large family where there was never enough of anything, not food, not warmth, not love. But he was different from his siblings, quieter, more observant. He could draw anything he saw with perfect accuracy. His teachers said he was intelligent, maybe even gifted. His father thought he might escape their circumstances through education, but that hope died when Yang was 16. At that age, he was sent to another city to attend high school, where he would live with a relative. In that home, Yang was treated like a servant, forced to forage for wild vegetables while his classmates bought meal tickets. The humiliation ate at him like acid. He dropped out, ran away, and sent a letter home, saying he was going to find work instead. But honest work didn't pay enough, so he stole. First, an aluminum pot from a restaurant that owed him wages, then more. Each theft gets easier than the last, each success feeding something dark inside him. But the decline came fast. 2 years in a labor camp for pickpocketing. After 2 years of incarceration, he got released, resuming his life of crime almost instantly. During this time, he met and fell in love with a local girl who he was planning to get married to before getting arrested again and thrown in prison. She promised to wait for him until his release, but promises break. When Yang returned from his second prison sentence, he found his girlfriend marrying someone else. The wedding celebration was in full swing when he arrived home. He watched from the shadows as she laughed in another man's arms. That day, something within him broke, something that could never be repaired. For 4 years, Yang Xinhai was on a killing spree through rural China. He killed 67 people across 4 provinces. Entire families erased from existence while they slept. Children who never woke up. Parents who died trying to protect them. He wore socks over his shoes to mask his footprints. He studied police procedures during his prison sentences and learned how to avoid detection. He targeted the poorest families because he knew their deaths wouldn't be prioritized. Most importantly, he never struck the same place twice, never gave investigators a chance to connect the dots. Each murder was treated as an isolated crime, a local tragedy, while Yang moved like a ghost from province to province. The tools changed: hammers, knives, shovels, axes. but the signature never did. Those holes punched through foreheads with mechanical precision, his calling card carved into the skulls of children and grandparents alike, 10 separate batteries, all in service of a hunger that could never be satisfied. Killing gave him a rush unlike anything else, that he didn't care whether his victims deserved to live or die. They were just obstacles between him and the high he craved. But this killing spree was about to come to an abrupt and bitter end. November 2002, a visiting police officer noticed something familiar about a crime scene in Hunan province. The brutal efficiency, the holes in the victims' heads, the sexual violence mixed with petty theft. She'd seen this exact pattern before in her own jurisdiction. Different city, different victims, but the same sick signature. That moment of recognition changed everything. For the first time, police departments began sharing information. The scattered crimes revealed themselves as links in a chain of horror stretching across half of China. A task force formed. Profiles were built. 30,000 fingerprints were analyzed. The net began to close, slowly but surely, around Yang Xinhai. But he wasn't done. Even as police flooded the countryside with wanted posters, even as villagers formed watch groups and barricaded their homes, Yang continued killing, moved to new provinces, adapted his methods. He was smart, careful, and absolutely without conscience. For months, it seemed like he might never be caught. 8 months later, another family was found murdered 400 miles away in Anhui province. An elderly woman named Qi Zhongying and her 2 grandchildren. The same brutal efficiency. The same holes punched through their skulls. The same mix of sexual violence and senseless brutality. By August 2001, the count was rising, and yet another household was it. A family of 3 in the city of Hunan. A father and his 2 children beaten to death in their sleep. September brought 2 more victims in the same province, beaten with hammers until their skulls cracked. December saw another couple murdered in their bed, stabbed and bludgeoned, before having those signature holes carved into their foreheads yet again. The killer was accelerating, growing bolder with each attack. And then, the year 2002 came, making it his bloodiest year ever. By January, 5 family members were found dead. Just weeks later, 3 more victims. By June, another family of 4 had been slaughtered. July brought 4 more deaths, with 2 victims sexually assaulted after death. The numbers climbed relentlessly. October 22nd. A father and his 6-year-old daughter were beaten with a spade while they slept. His pregnant wife escaped, but lost her unborn child from the trauma. Village after village. Province after province. The death toll mounting like a nightmare that refused to end. The media began calling him the Hammerman. China was being hunted by a serial killer unlike any they'd ever seen. A man who could travel hundreds of miles between murders, who could strike at families in their sleep and disappear without a trace. His name was Yang Xinhai. On a cold day in November 2003, Yang was sleeping in a public bathroom in Cow City. Dirty, homeless, carrying nothing but a pocket knife and 500 yuan in stolen money. A maintenance worker reported him as suspicious, and patrol officers came to investigate. They almost let him go. Just another drifter in a country full of them. But something about his Hunan accent, his evasive answers, his age and appearance matched the profile they'd been carrying for months. At the station, Yang Xinhai maintained his arrogance even when confronted with DNA evidence, but the evidence was overwhelming. Blood samples, fingerprints, witness testimonies from the few who'd survived his attacks. The web of violence he'd woven across 4 provinces slowly unraveled as he confessed to crime after crime. 67 murders, 23 sexual assaults, families destroyed for pocket change, and the thrill of taking lives. When asked why he'd done it, Yang Xinhai gave the only answer that mattered. When I killed people, it sparked a desire, and this inspired me to kill more. Han Fangying never got to hold her granddaughter one last time, never got to say goodbye to the son who'd visited her every morning for 34 years. The police released the bodies after the investigation, but by then they'd been evidence for so long that the family's grief had nowhere to land. She was 75 when young Xinhai was finally captured. Too old to find comfort in justice, too broken to celebrate his execution. The man who destroyed her family was just a name in the newspapers. Her son and grandchildren were still gone forever. Yang Xinhai went to trial in February 2004. The proceedings lasted 2 days. He showed no remorse, expressed no regret except that he hadn't been able to commit more crimes. When asked if he wanted to appeal his death sentence, he declined. For 15 days, he could have fought for his life. Instead, he waited in his cell, eating his meals with apparent satisfaction, talking to guards about the weather. On Valentine's Day, 2004, young Xinhai was executed by firing squad. A quick death, more merciful than anything he'd ever given his victims. But his death couldn't undo the damage, couldn't bring back the 67 people who died for his twisted pleasure. Couldn't restore the families he'd obliterated or heal the communities he'd terrorized.
On October 10th, 2008, in Edmonton, Canada, a 38-year-old man named Johnny Altinger told his friends he was heading out for a date with a woman he met online. He forwarded them the directions to her place, a common safety precaution. But after that night, Johnny was never seen or heard from again. Instead, his friends and family received bizarre emails claiming he had run off to Costa Rica with his new love. The only clues left behind were his passport sitting in his apartment and a missing red Mazda. The police investigation would soon uncover a rented garage and a chilling connection to the fictional TV serial killer, Dexter Morgan. How did a date from a popular website lead to a man's disappearance and unravel a story stranger and more terrifying than fiction? The man at the center of this twisted tale was an aspiring filmmaker named Mark Twitchell, a man who meticulously planned his descent from fantasy into a horrifying reality. Mark Twitchell was born in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, in 1979. Growing up, he seemed like a typical kid with big dreams. He was charismatic and ambitious, with a passion for filmmaking, particularly the Star Wars franchise. He married, had a daughter, and presented the image of a successful family man with a burgeoning career. But behind the scenes, Twitchell's life was a web of lies. He was unemployed, telling his wife he was going to work each day while he was actually spending his time in a rented garage, a space he told people was a film set. He was funding his movie projects by conning his friends into investing in his supposed Hollywood connections. His marriage was crumbling. He and his wife were living in separate parts of their house, and he was carrying on an affair with an old girlfriend. Twitchell was living a double life, but the secrets he was keeping were far darker than just infidelity and financial deception. He was cultivating a fantasy world, one that was about to spill violently into the real world. This fantasy was heavily influenced by a character he deeply admired, Dexter Morgan, the vigilante serial killer from the hit TV show. The garage wasn't just a film set, it was becoming something much more sinister. Before Johnny Altinger vanished, another man had a terrifying encounter in that same garage. Gilles Tetreault, a 33-year-old man, also thought he was meeting a woman named Sheena from the Plenty of Fish dating website. The directions led him to a residential garage, where he was told the door would be left open for him. The moment he stepped inside, the friendly date turned into a nightmare. He was ambushed from behind by a man in a painted hockey mask. The attacker, Mark Twitchell, pointed what looked like a real gun at him and ordered him to the ground, with his world plunged into blackness by a strip of duct tape. In that instant, he understood. This was a fight for his life. In a surge of adrenaline, he ripped the tape from his eyes and confronted his attacker. He lunged for the gun and was relieved to feel that it was plastic. A desperate struggle ensued. Tetreault, weakened by what he later learned was a stun baton, fought back with everything he had. He managed to slip out of his jacket as Twitchell grabbed him, rolled under the garage door, and scrambled to his car. His legs felt weak and unresponsive, but he managed to start the engine and speed away, leaving his would-be killer in the dark garage. Shaken, embarrassed, and confused, Gilles Tétrault didn't go to the police. He tried to forget the bizarre and terrifying event, convincing himself it was just a robbery gone wrong. He had no idea how lucky he had been. Twitchell's first attempt had failed, but he was a quick learner. He wouldn't make the same mistakes twice. Just 1 week after Gilles Tétrault's narrow escape, Johnny Altinger answered a similar ad. On October 10th, 2008, the 38-year-old left for his date, having sent the directions to his friends. When he arrived at the garage, he was met with the same trap, but this time, Twitchell was prepared. Learning from his first attempt, he didn't rely solely on the stun baton. He struck Johnny over the head with a heavy lead pipe, incapacitating him immediately. What happened next was pulled directly from the pages of a horror script. Twitchell moved Johnny to a makeshift processing table he had set up in the garage, complete with plastic sheeting, just like his hero Dexter Morgan. There, he ended Johnny Altinger's life with a knife. Afterward, he began the grisly process of dismembering the body. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a cold, calculated act. Twitchell then accessed Johnny's apartment, sending out the now infamous emails to Johnny's friends and family, creating the illusion that he had simply decided to leave the country. He took Johnny's red Mazda, further solidifying his fabricated story. But Twitchell's meticulous planning was about to be unraveled by a single digital breadcrumb he left behind. The strange emails from Johnny immediately raised red flags for his friends. It was completely out of character for the responsible 38-year-old. When he didn't show up for work, his friends grew more concerned. They broke into his apartment and found his passport, dirty dishes in the sink, and everything else suggesting he had just stepped out for a short while. With this information, they went to the police, who launched a missing person investigation. The police's first priority was to find the missing red Mazda. They searched airport parking lots, thinking he might have actually gone to Costa Rica, but turned up nothing. The biggest break in the case came from the very directions Johnny had forwarded to his friends as a safety measure. The police were led directly to the garage, rented by Mark Twitchell. When they first questioned him, Twitchell was calm and cooperative. He explained that the garage was a set for his new horror film, House of Cards, a story about a killer who lures a man to a garage via the internet. He even dismissed what looked like bloodstains as fake movie props. He seemed more interested in bragging about his film career than being a suspect in a disappearance. But then, he made a crucial mistake. In a later conversation with police, he casually mentioned that he had recently bought a red car from a stranger for just $40. This unbelievable story, coupled with the eerie similarities between his movie plot and the real-life disappearance, put him squarely in the investigators' crosshairs. The investigation into Mark Twitchell was intensifying. While he maintained his innocence, detectives were digging deeper into his life. Their search of his belongings uncovered his laptop, and on it, a deleted file that would blow the case wide open. The file was titled Skay Confessions, with Skay believed to be shorthand for serial killer. The document read like a diary, a first-person account of a man's journey into becoming a murderer. The document detailed the luring of two men to a garage. It described the first victim's escape, matching Gilles Tétrault's experience almost word for word. Then, it recounted the successful murder and dismemberment of the second victim. The text was chillingly specific. I plunged the knife deep into his neck. It was unbelievable. The document also described the killer's attempts to dispose of the body. First, by trying to burn the remains, and then by attempting to dump them in a river, before finally settling on a sewer. The narrative was a confession, a screenplay, and a diary all rolled into one. For investigators, it was a direct look into the mind of their suspect. The lines between Mark Twitchell the filmmaker and Mark Twitchell the killer had completely dissolved. The document was his story, written in his own words. Now, they just had to prove it. In March of 2011, Mark Twitchell went on trial for the first-degree murder of Johnny Altinger. The prosecution's star witness was Gilles Tétrault, the man who had survived. His testimony provided a living link to the events described in Skay Confessions, proving it was not a work of fiction. When Twitchell took the stand in his own defense, he spun an incredible tale. He claimed the entire affair was a publicity stunt for his movie that had gone horribly wrong. He alleged that he intended to let both men go, hoping they would spread the word about their terrifying experience and generate buzz for his film. He claimed he killed Johnny Altinger in self-defense after Johnny became enraged at being tricked. The jury didn't buy it. They took just 5 hours to find him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. But the story wasn't over. For a year and a half, Johnny Altinger's remains were still missing. Then, while awaiting trial, Twitchell finally broke his silence. He provided police with a hand-drawn map, with an X marking the spot. It led them to a sewer grate just a block and a half from his parents' house, where they found Johnny's partial remains, bringing a small measure of closure to his devastated family. Even from behind bars, Mark Twitchell's obsession with his own story continued. He corresponded with author Steve Lillibuen, who wrote a book about the case. In his letters, Twitchell never wavered from his self-defense claim, yet he also seemed to embrace his dark persona, writing, "It is what it is, and I am what I am." In a final, twisted turn of events, the rights to Lillibuen's book were sold to a film company. The aspiring filmmaker, who created a real-life horror movie in his quest for fame, may finally get his story on the big screen. The case of the Dexter killer serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most monstrous characters aren't on screen, but are sitting right next to us, dreaming of their own twisted close-up.